The king was enraged. He sent his troops, he destroyed those murderers, and he burned their city. Bind him hand and foot, and throw him into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Don't you love it? Don't you love it when we encounter these vivid passages in our Bible of a wrathful and an angry and a destroying God? Should we assume this parable of a king to be about God? How do we put such images next to the loving, all-embracing God who welcomes us always, forever ready to forgive and to restore our relationship? This parable we hear from the Gospel of Matthew today is actually the third parable. It's part of Jesus' reply to the question of his authority. 2 weeks ago, if we'd had it, and it wasn't St. Matthew's Day, it would have been the one of the two sons who are asked to go and work in the vineyard, and one says, yep, and doesn't do it, and the other says, nup, and does do it. And last week, if it hadn't been St. Francis Day, we would have heard the one of the wicked tenants in the vineyard. Each of these is spoken in the temple to the Jewish religious leaders. We read today's parable as one continuous story, although we might see it as two stories, one next to the other. Both are using allegory to portray their message. Today's stories open with the declaration, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son." Because this follows in the lineage of those other two parables, we might get some guesses as to who the characters might be identified within this allegorical tale. The king we might understand as God, his son Jesus. The invited guests, like those wicked tenants of the vineyard, are identified at the end of that parable as the chief priests and the Pharisees. So the first slaves who were sent out we could understand as being the Hebrew prophets. The second and the third sets of slaves that were sent out, the early Christian missionaries. The city that is burned and destroyed, that is Jerusalem, which was destroyed about 70 AD, some time before this compilation Gospel of Matthew's was compiled. And the good and the bad who came to fill the banquet hall with a mixed membership of Matthew's church. So, as we heard, the first story ends with the wedding hall filled with guests both good and bad, who were gathered from the street by the third set of slaves. It begins with the king calling those already invited to the wedding banquet of his son. Now, once again, to give a bit of context, according to the custom of the time, because I don't know that accurate timepieces were available, much less cell phones with pinging calendar reminders, the preparation for a banquet was time-consuming. So the custom was that invitations would be sent out and accepted well in advance. Once the banquet was ready, the host would send notice. But, we hear, the guests would not come. They didn't even offer an excuse. They just refused the invitation. It was one thing, perhaps even a privilege, to have been invited to such an event. Accepting an invitation in principle for some future event is easy and convenient enough. But now the invitation calls for action, and the guest can only see its inconvenience. Let's think for a moment. Think of our world, our context, and the things before us. Is this parable a story for back then, or is it a story for now? This bit of extra knowledge we have It might cause us, therefore, to reflect upon our sense of divine call, however we understand that has found us in this place, as this Christ-following place. Maybe we are happy to accept the invitation to belong and become a member of the body of Christ. The invitation is great, in principle. But the invitation becomes somewhat less convenient when it comes to the particular. We're happy to embrace the discipleship that does not move us outside our comfort zones and to live out ways of discipleship that don't challenge us to change. Could that be true? The king then sends out a second lot of slaves to the same people already invited, who have already accepted the invitation. The king seeks to persuade them, tempting them with the lusciousness and the desirability and the abundance of the feast, the one that has been prepared and laid out ready. All they have to do to receive this abundance is to respond. In real life, it is unlikely a king would give the subjects a second chance, much less try and persuade them to take up the chance. But with allegory, there's a freedom to go beyond the usual. Maybe the author intends to make a point about this king, who's no ordinary king. For this is God, whose grace goes beyond ordinary expectations or experience. The second time, the invitees give a number of excuses. Interestingly, the preoccupation of those who give the various excuses is with good, rather than with bad things. It's not as if they're out partying and drinking. No, they're distracted by what you might understand as the vocations to which God has called them. Maybe we'll have time for God when we've finished being consumed with all the things that keep us busy. Perhaps there's room to pencil God in on our to-do list, or we'll simply make a mental note that God's important, and God can just wait till we've got plenty of time. The first part of the story is framed to speak against the Jewish leaders, maybe representative of their people, those who had not responded to God's call to attend the abundant wedding feast of God's Son, who refused to acknowledge Jesus' authority. At first, they simply did nothing, and then they were otherwise engaged, and then they became actively resistant, persecuting and killing those who brought and reminded them of their obligation to respond to God's welcome. The destruction of Jerusalem, that city that was burned, Matthew would wish to make clear was the judgment of God upon people who had rejected the invitation to God's banquet in the fullness of time. So as this story tells, those invited had proved themselves not worthy. But God's generosity and overabundant hospitality reaches beyond our imagining. The king sends more slaves into the main street to invite those they find who will respond to God's call, and they do come and they do gather, good and bad. Historically, apparently, the church of Matthew's day offered such openness. It found an eager audience amongst those not welcome elsewhere, the irreligious and the outcast, those banned from the synagogue because of mental or physical conditions. I want to ask you again, is this parable a story for back then, or is it a story for now? Because as we reflect on this, we might be tempted to think this analogy is speaking of God writing off the Jewish people and replacing them with the people of the street. Maybe we would even stretch to say we, as good Christians, are the people of the street. Well, we could go there, but we still haven't faced the second, much briefer part of the story. So here we are. We're in the middle of this abundant wedding feast. The hall is filled with people who are both good and bad, who have answered the call. Then the king arrives. The first thing he notices, and it does happen to be a man in the text, but somebody who's not wearing a wedding robe. Now, as I've said, this is allegory, and it's got a capacity to embrace extensions of reality, so we can put aside that slightly finer detail of how somebody fresh off the street, not expecting to go to a wedding feast, would be dressed appropriately. because you would have thought the king's generosity could extend to clothing them appropriately. But anyway, the thing is that the person stands out. It's noticed because he's not clothed as the others. This story is being told in the context of the Gospel of Matthew, and there's some things about Matthew that are important. There is no privilege on the basis of status. Only a life of transformed attitude and performance counts, according to Matthew. It's Matthew's Jesus who warns the disciples their righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. It's Matthew's Jesus that says not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, only those who do the will of the Father. That the kingdom of heaven will be taken from those who do not bear fruit and will be given to those who do. The invitation to this wedding banquet, the call to be present, granted those found, those who hear and respond, is not dependent on pre-approved worthiness, but something is asked if we respond. We are expected to change, to don the garment appropriate to the context in keeping with the occasion of feasting at this wedding banquet. What in heaven's name is the garment, you might be asking? Well, I want to just trip across a little bit to Colossians, because it says in Colossians 3 something like this. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. They echo in the beautiful words we heard today from Philippians. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. Whatever is true, whatever is honourable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. We may know how we're called to behave, and we may know that we should aspire to live and be people who are clothed thus. We also know we don't do it that often or consistently succeed. It is hard to live like that. We do not live in, we do not see reflected in the face of our world anything like that. Such hope and aspiration is really hard to find. And it is a struggle, therefore, for us to not end up simply reflecting the world that is so shown to us consistently. It can be hard to hold on to that thread of hope from which the garment is spun. And yet, today's gospel says, this is what is required of us. To declare, to insist there is an alternative way to that which dominates in our world today. There is another way to live in and respond to the world, because there is another way to see the world. To insist that the world reflects not only the humanly created images forever flashing before us, rather, the world is a place that reveals and expresses divine blessing. Having responded to the invitation to join the feasting at the wedding banquet of God, we remain aware of our presence there as those who choose to change, who choose to acquire the garment fitting for our place there. It requires something of us, even if some days it feels our faithful response is more form than genuine content. Each day, each moment, to choose to look for and to seek and to notice and to speak of a world threaded through with divine presence, of grace and of blessing revealed, of divine grace and goodness bringing all that is into being, more pervasive than and prevailing over anything that would seek to extinguish it or to diminish it. This gospel, so they say, was in reply to the question of Jesus' authority. It was spoken to the religious leaders in the temple. Matthew doesn't let it rest back there, though. He confronts and disrupts us now. Quite how are we clothed?